There was once a quiet girl who rarely spoke much in school. She was the kind of student who liked to sit by the window, lost in her own thoughts while the world around her moved fast. Others called her shy, but that wasn't exactly true. She wasn't afraid of people. She just loved silence, the kind that lets you notice small things others miss. Every afternoon, she walked home alone, her school bag slightly torn at one corner, her shoes a little dusty from the long walk. She didn't mind it. On her way, she often passed a music shop that had a piano in the front window. It was old, with a few scratches on its surface, but the keys looked magical to her. Sometimes, she would stop and watch as the owner played soft tunes for the customers. Those few minutes made her forget everything else. At school, there was also a piano, an upright one sitting in the corner of the auditorium. It was covered with a dark cloth most of the time. During morning assemblies or events, a teacher or one of the senior students would play a piece on it. The sound would fill the big hall and echo softly off the walls. Every time she heard it, her heart felt warm. It was as if the piano spoke a language that only she could understand. But she never dared to touch it. To her classmates, that piano was just an instrument. To her, it was something sacred, something you had to earn the right to play. One day, when classes were over and the school hall was empty, she stayed behind. The sound of footsteps faded as everyone left for the playground. She looked around and walked slowly toward the piano. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the cloth. The keys were a little dusty, but they still shone under the dim light. She reached out and pressed one softly. The sound was faint, a single note that echoed gently across the empty hall. Just as she was about to press another key, laughter burst from behind her. She froze. A few classmates had returned to grab their forgotten bags and had seen her. "Look at her," one of them said, laughing. "She thinks she's a musician now." Another added, "Don't break it, you don't even know what you're doing." Her face turned red, and she quickly stepped back. She tried to smile and act like it didn't matter, but inside she felt her heart sink. Their laughter echoed louder than the piano note she had played. Without a word, she picked up her bag and walked out. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, hearing their voices again and again. But she also remembered how that single note had sounded, the softness, the depth, the way it lingered. It was such a small thing, yet it made her feel alive. She decided that no matter how others laughed, she wanted to learn. The next day, during lunch break, she went back to the auditorium. This time she checked carefully to make sure no one was there. She sat on the wooden bench in front of the piano and gently pressed another key. Then another. Slowly, she began to experiment with different combinations of notes. The sounds didn't make sense yet, but she could feel a kind of rhythm forming in her head. When she heard footsteps in the hallway, she quickly covered the piano and left. This became her little secret. Whenever she could find a few minutes alone, she would sneak into the hall and touch the keys again. Sometimes it was only for a minute before someone came in, but those few seconds were enough to make her day better. At home, her parents noticed she had become quieter than usual. She was always drawing something on paper, little black and white shapes that looked like tiny ladders. They didn't realize she was sketching piano keys, trying to remember how each one sounded. Her family didn't have a piano or a keyboard, and lessons were too expensive, but she didn't let that stop her. She cut out strips of paper and drew a full set of piano keys on them. Every night, she would place that paper on her desk and pretend to play. Her little brother sometimes laughed when he saw her doing it. "You can't hear anything," he said. She smiled and replied, "I can hear it in my head," and she could. She imagined the sound of every note she pressed, as if the real piano was right there in front of her. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, her fingers started to remember the spacing of the keys. At school, she watched closely whenever the music teacher played, trying to notice which keys made which sounds. Sometimes, when everyone clapped after a performance, she was the only one who wasn't clapping. She was studying the movements instead. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. The music teacher was preparing for a school event and needed someone to help move things around in the auditorium. The girl volunteered immediately. As she arranged chairs and decorations, The teacher sat at the piano, practicing a slow, emotional tune. The girl paused and watched silently. The teacher noticed her gaze and smiled. "Do you like music?" the teacher asked. The girl nodded shyly. "Do you play?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really, I just like listening." The teacher smiled again. "Listening is the first step. You can learn to play anytime if your heart is in it." Those simple words stayed with her. She went home that day feeling like someone had lit a tiny lamp inside her. It was the first time an adult had encouraged her, and it felt powerful. From then on, she practiced her paper keyboard more seriously. Her hands moved faster, her mind sharper. She even borrowed a small music book from the school library and copied notes into her notebook. She didn't understand all the symbols, but she kept going, trusting that she'd figure them out someday. One evening, her father came home with a surprise. It wasn't new. It was an old, second-hand keyboard, a little scratched, but it worked. He said he got it cheap from someone at work who didn't need it anymore. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her hands shook as she touched the keys for the first time. That night, the house was filled with soft, broken sounds. Wrong notes, slow rhythms, clumsy melodies. But to her, it was beautiful. She stayed up late, practicing until her fingers were sore. Her mother peeked in and smiled softly before turning off the hallway light. In the following weeks, her routine changed. Every evening after finishing her homework, she played. Some days, she got frustrated when the sounds didn't match what she imagined. Other days, she felt like she was flying. Slowly, her hands began to find their way naturally. At school, she still didn't talk much. The teasing hadn't completely stopped, but she had learned to ignore it. Whenever someone laughed at her or called her quiet, she thought about the piano and smiled. It had become her secret world, one that no one could take away. A few months later, the school announced an upcoming talent show. The teacher encouraged everyone to participate. When the sign-up sheet was passed around, she hesitated for a long time. Her heart pounded as she watched others write their names next to singing or dancing. When it came to her turn, she almost passed it on. But something inside her whispered, "Why not?" She picked up the pen and wrote her name beside the word piano. The moment she did, she felt both terrified and excited. That evening, she sat by her keyboard at home, staring at the keys. "You and I," she whispered, "we have to be brave." And so she practiced harder than ever. Every night she played until her eyes grew heavy, perfecting a song she had learned from watching online videos. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. One afternoon, while she was alone in the auditorium, she tried playing the same piece on the school piano. Her hands trembled at first, but as she continued, the music filled the air. She didn't notice that a few students had stopped outside the door to listen. When she finished, one of them whispered, "Was that really her?" She looked up, startled, but instead of laughter, she saw something different in their faces. Curiosity. For the first time, they weren't teasing her. They were listening. That night, she walked home with a small smile on her face. The sun was setting behind her, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. She felt lighter, like a quiet strength had grown inside her. She didn't know what would happen at the talent show yet. She didn't know whether people would cheer or laugh. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care. She was doing it for herself, for the little girl who once touched the piano and was laughed at. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of her story. After she signed her name on that sheet for the talent show, her life quietly started to change. No one else noticed it, but inside her, something was growing. A quiet determination that refused to fade. She knew people still whispered and laughed when they saw her name on the list, but now those words didn't sting the same way. They only made her want to work harder. Every afternoon after school, she rushed home, finished her chores, and sat by her small keyboard. It wasn't perfect. The sound was tinny, and one of the keys didn't work anymore. But to her, it was still the most beautiful thing she owned. The moment her fingers touched those keys, the world outside seemed to disappear. The noise of her classmates, the teasing, the loneliness. All of it faded away. Her room was small, but she kept it tidy. The keyboard sat on a wooden table near the window, where the sunlight fell across the keys every evening. Sometimes, when the power went out, she would still sit there in the dim glow of a candle, pretending to play. She memorized the sound of each note, the way they rose and fell like waves. She had no teacher, no lessons, no one to correct her mistakes. Everything she learned came from patience and curiosity. She borrowed old music books from the library, even though most of the notes didn't make sense at first. Some nights, she stayed up late watching online tutorials on her small phone, turning the volume low so she wouldn't wake anyone. Her mother often peeked into her room and whispered, "It's late, you should sleep." She would smile and say, "Just one more time. I almost got it right." Her fingers sometimes ached from pressing the keys too long, but she didn't care. Every mistake taught her something new. She learned how to play simple melodies, how to move her hands faster, how to feel the rhythm instead of just counting beats. The more she practiced, the more the music began to feel alive inside her. At school, she still didn't talk much, but her eyes carried a quiet spark now. Sometimes, while sitting in class, she tapped her fingers on the desk, replaying the songs in her mind. Her teachers noticed she seemed more focused, more confident in small ways. But no one knew why. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. Some nights she wondered if she was foolish to believe she could learn something so big all on her own. The piano was not easy. It demanded time, patience, and a heart that refused to give up. There were times she hit the wrong note again and again until she wanted to cry. But every time that frustration built up, she remembered the sound she wanted to create. The one that could touch hearts the way her teacher's music once touched hers. On weekends, when the weather was good, she took her keyboard outside and practiced in the courtyard behind her small house. The neighbors sometimes heard her and smiled, though a few joked about her playing being a little noisy. She laughed it off. Even when someone teased her, she didn't feel angry anymore. It almost amused her how they couldn't see what she was trying to build. A few weeks later, she began composing small pieces of her own. They weren't perfect or complicated, but they were hers. She would hum little tunes while cooking or doing chores, then run to her keyboard to find the notes that matched her humming. Slowly, she started to understand how music worked. Not from books or lessons, but from feeling. One day, as she was practicing a soft melody, her father came home early and stood by the door without saying a word. She didn't notice him at first. When she finally looked up, she froze, thinking he might be upset about the noise. But instead, he smiled and said, "That sounds beautiful. I didn't know you could play like that." She blushed and looked down. "I'm still learning," she said softly. Her father nodded. "Keep going. You never know where it might take you." Those words became another quiet motivation for her. From that day, she practiced even harder, pushing herself to get every note right. The days went by faster than she realized. The talent show was approaching, and though she hadn't told anyone what song she would play, she knew she wanted it to mean something. She didn't want to perform just to show people she could play now. She wanted them to feel something through her music. At school, preparations for the event filled the air with excitement. Students practiced dances, rehearsed skits, and tuned guitars in the hallways. Whenever someone mentioned the piano performance, her classmates would glance her way and whisper. Some were curious, others still skeptical. One afternoon, while everyone else was busy decorating the auditorium, she slipped inside quietly. The big piano stood there, waiting. She sat down on the bench and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the keys, but then muscle memory took over. She started to play the piece she had practiced for weeks. A mix of sadness and hope, something that began soft and slowly grew stronger. The notes filled the hall, rising and falling like a story being told without words. She didn't know that someone was standing by the doorway, the same teacher who had once asked her if she liked music. When she finished, she looked up and froze. The teacher smiled warmly. "You've been practicing, haven't you?" The girl nodded, her cheeks turning pink. "Yes, every day." The teacher walked closer and said softly, "You play with feeling. That's something you can't teach from a book. Hearing that filled her with pride and relief. Someone finally understood. After that day, the teacher let her use the auditorium piano after school whenever it was free. It became her secret world, a place where she could practice without interruptions. Sometimes, she lost track of time, playing until the sun disappeared behind the windows. One evening, as she packed her bag to leave, she heard footsteps. A few classmates had wandered in. They watched her for a moment, whispering to each other. One of them said, "I didn't know you could actually play." She smiled awkwardly and replied, "I'm still learning." They didn't tease her this time. They just nodded and left quietly. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. At home, she could hardly sleep. Her mind was full of melodies. She thought about how music could change how people felt, even if only for a few minutes. She realized that maybe her goal wasn't to prove anything. It was to share something honest, something real. As the day of the talent show drew closer, her nervousness grew. Sometimes, she'd mess up during practice just because she imagined all the eyes watching her. She would stop, take a deep breath, and start over. She told herself that fear was normal, it meant she cared. On the night before the performance, she sat alone in her room, staring at the keyboard. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but she didn't play. Instead, she whispered softly, "No matter what happens, just play from the heart." Her mother came in with a cup of warm milk and said gently, "You'll do fine. You've worked hard for this." She smiled. "I just want them to listen. Not to me, but to the music." That night, she dreamed of the piano again. She saw herself on stage, her fingers moving with confidence, the sound filling the hall, the same way she had always imagined. But when she looked at the audience, she couldn't see faces, just soft light, like stars. It was peaceful. When she woke up the next morning, the sky outside was bright and clear. It was the day she had been waiting for. She felt her heart racing, but there was also a strange calmness deep inside her. She packed her things carefully, including a small lucky charm her brother had made from a piece of ribbon. As she left home, her parents wished her good luck. The walk to school felt longer than usual. Every step echoed with memories. The laughter, the long hours of practice, the moments of doubt, and the quiet victories no one else saw. When she reached the auditorium, she saw other students rehearsing nervously. She sat quietly in a corner, waiting for her turn, trying to steady her breathing. The teacher walked by, gave her a reassuring smile and whispered, "Just play like you always do. Forget the crowd." She nodded, gripping her small charm tightly. Her name was called last. As she stood up, she could feel her hands shaking slightly, but her heart was steady. She walked toward the piano, each step echoing on the wooden floor. The lights were bright, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to fade. She sat down on the bench, took a deep breath, and looked at the keys. They looked the same as always, familiar, kind, patient. And right there, in that quiet moment before the first note, she realized something important. All those hidden hours, all those nights when no one saw her practicing, all those times she doubted herself, they weren't wasted. They had led her here. She smiled softly to herself and whispered, "Let's begin." And with that, her fingers pressed the first key. The day of the school event had finally arrived, and the whole campus buzzed with excitement. Bright posters were hung across the hallways, colorful lights glowed around the stage, and the faint smell of fresh paint and flowers filled the air. Students were running here and there, some adjusting decorations, others checking sound systems, and a few nervously practicing behind the curtains. It was the biggest event of the year, and everyone wanted to shine. She sat quietly on one of the wooden benches near the side of the auditorium, clutching her small music notebook. Inside it were a few scribbled notes and a simple reminder she had written to herself weeks ago. "Play with your heart." That single line had guided her through every practice session, every late night when her fingers hurt, every moment when doubt whispered in her mind. Now that the moment had finally come, her hands trembled slightly, but her heart felt strangely steady. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a deep kind of anticipation, The feeling you get before something important is about to happen. All around her, students were chatting excitedly. Some were dressed in costumes for plays, others tuned their guitars or checked their microphones. She watched quietly, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of her notebook. A few classmates who had once teased her passed by. One of them looked at her for a moment and gave a small smile, almost like an unspoken apology. She returned it softly and looked away. When her teacher walked past to check on everyone, she stopped beside her and asked gently, "Are you ready?" She nodded. "A little nervous," she admitted. "That's good," the teacher said with a kind smile. "Nervous means you care. Just remember what we practiced. Don't play for them, play for yourself." Those words echoed in her head long after the teacher left. The event started with the sound of applause and cheers as the principal gave a short welcome speech. The lights dimmed slightly, and one by one, performances began. There were singers, dancers, poetry recitations, and even a funny short play that made everyone laugh. The atmosphere was full of life and energy. But for her, sitting backstage, time seemed to move differently. Each performance brought her closer to her own turn. She listened as others performed, clapping politely, but her mind was on her piece. She could almost hear the melody in her head, the soft beginning, the slow build-up, and the strong finish that always made her feel free. As she waited, she remembered how far she had come. The girl who once got laughed at for touching the piano was now about to perform on stage in front of the whole school. She thought of all those quiet nights spent practicing, the candlelight, the broken key on her keyboard, her parents' encouragement, and her teacher's faith in her. It all felt like it had led to this moment. When the host finally announced her name, her heart jumped. The sound of clapping filled the hall as she stood up. Her knees felt a little weak, but she took a deep breath and started walking toward the stage. The stage lights were brighter than she remembered. They made it hard to see faces in the crowd, and maybe that was a good thing. It made it easier to forget how many people were watching. The piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. She walked up to it slowly, feeling the smooth surface of the instrument as she sat down on the bench. Her hands rested on her lap for a moment. She could feel her pulse beating fast. From somewhere in the audience, she heard a faint whisper. Someone saying her name followed by a small laugh. But she didn't let it reach her heart this time. She looked down at the keys, took one deep breath, and placed her fingers on them. The first note echoed softly through the hall. It was shaky at first, like her hands hadn't caught up with her courage yet. But as she moved to the next few notes, something inside her shifted. Her hands began to move naturally, just as they had countless nights before when no one was watching. The melody filled the room, soft, emotional, almost like a story being told without words. Each note carried a piece of her journey. The laughter she endured, the quiet hours she practiced, the hope she had held on to when no one believed in her. The audience, who had been chatting moments before, slowly grew silent. Even the small whispers faded away. By the time she reached the middle part of her piece, the nerves had melted away completely. She forgot the crowd, the lights, the pressure. All she felt was the rhythm, the emotion flowing through her fingertips. The music rose higher, stronger, like a wave about to break. Then came the soft part again, a slow, gentle stretch of notes that felt like a sigh. She closed her eyes for a moment and let her heart guide her. It was in that silence between notes that the beauty of her music truly came alive. When the final note faded, there was complete stillness. For a second, she thought maybe she had done something wrong. Maybe people didn't like it. She looked up, unsure. Then the sound of clapping started, slowly at first, then louder and louder. People stood up from their seats, applauding. Some cheered. Even the ones who had once teased her were clapping, their faces filled with surprise and respect. The teacher backstage wiped away a tear, smiling proudly. She sat there for a moment, almost frozen, her eyes wide. She hadn't expected this. She bowed her head slightly, smiling shyly, and then stood up. As she walked off the stage, her heart felt light, almost weightless. Backstage, the teacher hugged her and whispered, "You did it. She laughed softly, still catching her breath. "I was so nervous," she said. "You couldn't tell," the teacher replied. "That was beautiful." Other students came up to her too, some still clapping her on the back, others saying things like, "I didn't know you could play like that," or "That was amazing." She thanked them quietly, smiling, not out of pride, but out of relief. Later, as the show ended and students began packing up decorations, she sat near the edge of the stage, looking at the piano once more. The crowd was gone now, but the air still seemed to hum with the echoes of her music. For a long moment, she just sat there, remembering the sound. It wasn't the applause that stayed with her. It was the silence before it. That moment when the last note hung in the air and no one made a sound. That silence felt sacred, like the whole world had stopped to listen. As she picked up her notebook, she noticed something. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Walking home that evening, the streets felt different. The sky was painted in orange and pink, and the cool air brushed against her face. People passed by, chatting and laughing, but she walked quietly, smiling to herself. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about finding her own voice, the kind that didn't need words. When she reached home, her parents were waiting for her. Her father asked how it went. She simply said, "It went well," but her mother noticed the way her eyes sparkled and smiled knowingly. After dinner, she went to her room, turned on her small keyboard, and began to play again. Not for practice this time, but just because she wanted to. The music flowed effortlessly. Every note seemed lighter now, freer, as if her heart had finally opened. She thought about how strange life was. The same piano that once made her feel embarrassed and small was now the reason she felt alive and strong. She had turned something that once caused her pain into something beautiful. Before sleeping, she wrote a small line at the end of her notebook. "Don't play to impress. Play to express." That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop smiling. She replayed the moment in her mind. The soft light of the stage, the stillness of the audience, the applause, the warmth in her teacher's eyes. Felt like a dream, but it was real. She knew there would be more challenges ahead. Maybe even more people who wouldn't understand her. But now she had something they couldn't take away. A sense of purpose, a quiet belief in herself. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. There were more songs to learn, more stages to play on, more stories to tell through her music. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint hum of the night outside her window. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played a soft tune, and she smiled to herself. Tomorrow she would play again. Not because she had to, but because now, she couldn't imagine a life without it. The days that followed the school event felt like a quiet dream. Everywhere she went, people smiled at her differently. Teachers greeted her warmly, and students who had never spoken to her before stopped her in the hallway just to say, "That song you played, it was amazing." She never expected it. For so long, she had been the quiet girl sitting in the back of the class, someone others barely noticed. Now, when she walked through the corridors, it felt as though the silence she once carried had turned into something people respected. But even with all that new attention, she didn't change much. She still sat near the window during breaks, still preferred the sound of music over the sound of chatter. She smiled politely when people talked to her, but deep inside, her heart was calm. She wasn't chasing praise. What mattered most to her was the peace she felt when her fingers touched the keys. Every afternoon, after school, she continued to practice. She no longer had to hide or wait for an empty hall. The music teacher trusted her now and even gave her a spare key to the music room. "You've earned it," the teacher said one day with a gentle smile. "Use the piano whenever you want." That small gesture meant everything. It wasn't just a key, it was trust, freedom, and a quiet acknowledgement of her effort. The more she played, the more her confidence grew. Sometimes, she played while younger students peeked through the doorway, listening shyly. She didn't mind. If her music made someone smile, that was enough for her. But one afternoon, something happened that she would never forget. It was a quiet day after classes had ended. Most students had already gone home. The sun was low, casting golden light across the empty schoolyard. Inside the auditorium, the air felt still, almost peaceful. She sat at the piano, running her fingers softly across the keys, thinking of what to play next. Then, the teacher walked in and said, "Would you like to help me with something special?" She looked up curiously. "The school has a community event next week," the teacher explained. "Many parents and guests will attend. I'd like you to play a short piece to open the program. Only a few minutes long, but it would mean a lot." Her heart fluttered. A public performance not just for students but for adults, parents, teachers, guests she had never met. The idea scared her, but at the same time, it thrilled her. She nodded slowly. "I can try," she said. The teacher smiled. "Don't try, just play the way you always do. That's what makes your music special." For the next few days, she practiced harder than ever. This time, she didn't just want to play well. She wanted her music to say something. She wanted people to feel what she felt. The quiet courage, the patience, the beauty of never giving up. She chose a song that started soft and slow, almost like a whisper. It wasn't famous or complicated. It was a simple piece she had written herself, one that told her story through sound. On the morning of the event, the whole school looked different. The hall was decorated with ribbons, banners, and flowers. Parents filled the seats, chatting softly as they waited for the program to begin. Teachers checked the microphones. Students hurried around adjusting chairs. Backstage, she sat alone, her hands resting on her lap. She could hear the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain, and every sound made her heart beat faster. The teacher came over and knelt beside her. "Are you ready?" She nodded, though her throat felt dry. "A little nervous," she whispered. "That's natural," the teacher said kindly. "When you walk out there, don't look at the crowd. Just look at the piano. It's your friend." She smiled faintly. "My friend," she repeated. Moments later, her name was announced. She stood, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the stage. The lights were warm against her face, and the sea of people before her looked endless. But when she looked at the piano sitting under the spotlight, everything else faded away. She walked over slowly, her shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor. She sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. For a brief moment, she froze. She could hear whispers from the audience. Small, curious voices wondering if she was the same student who played at the talent show. Then she closed her eyes and let her fingers press the first note. It started softly, almost like a conversation between her heart and the piano. Each note carried a piece of her journey. The laughter she once endured, the lonely afternoons practicing, the quiet determination that no one saw. The melody floated through the hall, filling every corner with emotion. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple but pure. The sound was gentle, but it carried power, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. As she played, she felt tears welling up, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was because she could feel how far she had come. Maybe it was because, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of being seen. People in the audience began to lean forward. The conversations stopped. Even the restless children grew quiet. There was something about the music that held them still. The song grew stronger in the middle, the notes rising and falling like waves. It was as if the piano spoke the words she could never say aloud. Every emotion she had ever kept hidden came out through those keys. Her pain, her hope, her strength. Then came the final part. The melody slowed down, becoming softer again, like a deep breath after a long run. Each note lingered longer than the last, echoing gently in the silence of the hall. When she played the last chord, her hands stayed on the keys. The sound faded slowly until there was nothing left but quiet. She didn't move. She didn't even breathe for a moment. And then she realized the hall was completely silent. Hundreds of people sat there, not moving, not whispering. The kind of silence that didn't come from emptiness, but from awe. It was a silence full of meaning, heavy and beautiful. She looked up slowly, her heart pounding. The faces before her were calm, touched. A few people had tears in their eyes. Then, as if on cue, the applause began, soft at first, then louder, filling the hall like thunder. She smiled, her eyes glistening. The teacher standing at the side of the stage clapped with pride, eyes shining. When she stood and bowed, she didn't feel shy anymore. She felt grateful. Grateful for every hard day that had led her here, for every small step that built her courage. After the event ended, people came up to her to express how deeply the music had moved them. One parent said, "You didn't just play notes, you told a story." Another said softly, "That was the most peaceful thing I've heard in a long time." Her classmates gathered around her too, full of excitement and disbelief. "How did you learn to play like that?" one asked. She smiled humbly. "I just practiced," she said. But deep inside, she knew it was more than practice. It was patience, love, and the belief that even the quietest voices can make the loudest impact when they're honest. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, she returned to the empty auditorium. The stage was quiet again, the chairs neatly arranged, the decorations half taken down. She sat at the piano once more and ran her fingers across the keys gently. She didn't play this time. She just listened, to the faint hum of the world outside, to the stillness that lingered in the air. That silence, the one that came right after her last note earlier that day, kept replaying in her mind. It was the purest moment she had ever felt. A moment when the world had truly listened, not just with ears, but with hearts. For her, that silence meant everything. It meant that her music had reached people, that her dream had come to life. It wasn't about applause or praise anymore. It was about connection. She smiled to herself and whispered softly, "Thank you," as if the piano could hear her. As she stood up to leave, she looked back at the instrument one last time. It gleamed faintly under the dim light, almost as if it was smiling back. When she stepped outside, the sky was painted deep blue, and the first stars had begun to appear. She walked home slowly, feeling peaceful. The air was cool, and every step echoed softly on the ground. She knew she would keep playing, not to prove anything, but because music had become a part of her soul. It had taught her patience, courage, and the power of quiet strength. And somewhere in the distance, as she walked down the quiet street, she imagined that same silence again, the one that followed her final note and smiled. It was no longer just silence. It was understanding. The days after the big event passed slowly, but the memory of that night stayed with her like a warm light that refused to fade. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the silence that had filled the room after her last note faded away. It wasn't just quiet. It was something deeper, something that told her people had truly felt what she played. Life at school changed again, but this time, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She wasn't the shy girl sitting in the corner anymore, and she wasn't just the girl who played the piano either. She had become someone others respected for her dedication. Yet she didn't let it get to her head. She still preferred quiet corners, still loved to sit by the window, and still spent her free hours with her music. There was something peaceful about knowing that her hard work had finally spoken for her. It wasn't about showing off. It was about the feeling of being understood without saying a word. Her teacher often asked her to play during small school gatherings, and each time, she did it with calm confidence. The teasing that once hurt her so deeply had disappeared completely. Even the classmates who had mocked her were now kind. Some apologized in quiet ways, by cheering for her at performances or helping her carry the piano bench before shows. She never held grudges. Deep down, she knew their laughter back then came from misunderstanding, not cruelty. Her music teacher noticed her growth and one afternoon said, "You have something special. You don't just play music. You tell stories through sound. Have you ever thought about teaching others one day?" She looked surprised. "Teaching? I don't know if I could do that." "Why not?" the teacher replied gently. "You've already shown what patience and determination can do. Maybe someday someone else will need to learn that too, and you could be the one to guide them." That thought stayed in her mind. She never imagined herself as a teacher, but she liked the idea of helping others who were afraid to start. After all, she knew exactly what it felt like to be scared of trying. Years went by. She grew older, but she never let go of her piano. Even when life got busy, college, work, responsibilities, she always found time to sit at the keys. The sound of the piano was like her diary. Every note held a memory, a piece of her journey. Sometimes she would play in small cafes or community centers. The rooms were never large, but the faces that listened were always kind. She noticed something beautiful. No matter who the listeners were or where they came from, everyone reacted the same way. When her music began, people would fall silent. It was the same silence she had heard that day in school, the silence of hearts listening. It amazed her how sound could bring strangers together without a single word. One evening, after finishing a quiet performance at a local gathering, a little girl approached her. She looked no older than 10 and held her mother's hand tightly. Her voice was soft when she said, "I want to play like you one day, but my friends laugh at me when I try." She knelt down and smiled. "Do you love playing?" The girl nodded. "Yes, but I get nervous when they watch me." "Then play for yourself first," she said kindly. "The rest will follow. Don't let their laughter stop you. Sometimes people laugh because they don't understand what it means to try. But if you keep going, one day they'll listen instead." The little girl smiled, her eyes brightening, and her mother thanked her quietly before they left. That short conversation reminded her of her younger self, the girl who once sat alone, tracing fake piano keys on her desk because she had no real instrument to play. Life had come full circle. She was now the one giving courage to others. Over time, she began offering small lessons to children who couldn't afford expensive classes. Her sessions weren't just about notes and rhythm. They were about patience, hope, and expressing emotion. She would often tell her students, "It's okay to make mistakes. Music isn't about perfection. It's about feeling." Sometimes, when her students grew frustrated, she would tell them her story. Not in a dramatic way, but simply, how she had once been teased, how she had practiced on a paper keyboard, and how her music had eventually silenced a whole room. The children always listened closely, their eyes wide with surprise. Her story made them believe that even quiet beginnings could lead to something beautiful. She didn't realize it, but her story began to spread. Parents told other parents about her kindness, and slowly more children came to learn from her. It was never about money for her. She charged very little, sometimes nothing at all. What mattered was helping others discover the joy she had found. Her small group of students eventually performed together at a community center event. It wasn't fancy. No lights, no microphones, just simple instruments and honest effort. When they played, she stood behind them, smiling proudly. As the final note ended, the audience clapped warmly. Watching her students bow, she felt something stir inside her. That same familiar silence returned for a brief moment before the applause began. It was the same kind of silence that had changed her life years ago. And in that moment, she realized that music didn't just live in the notes. It lived in the spaces between them, in the quiet, in the hearts that listened, and in the connections that words could never make. Later that night, she sat alone by the piano in her small home. The room was softly lit, and the world outside was calm. Her fingers rested gently on the keys, but she didn't play yet. She just thought about how far she had come, from being that nervous girl hiding her dreams to someone whose music reached others. She whispered to herself, "You did it." But even as she said the words, she knew it wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt too small to try, too afraid to start. When she finally began to play, the melody that came out wasn't planned. It was something new, gentle, and full of life. Each note carried gratitude, for her parents who had believed in her, for her teacher who had given her the piano key, for the laughter that had once hurt her but had shaped her strength. The sound filled the room, echoing softly against the walls. Outside, the night breeze brushed through the open window, carrying the music out into the quiet street. Somewhere nearby, someone might have heard it. A passing stranger, a neighbor, maybe even a child who would one day be inspired to start their own journey. And that was enough. She didn't need fame or grand stages. She didn't need a crowd's approval. What mattered most was knowing that her music had become something bigger than her own story. It had become a reminder that kindness, patience, and courage could change more than just one person's life. She smiled as she finished her song and let the last note fade naturally into the night. The silence that followed was gentle, almost like a warm embrace. Years later, people in her town would still remember her performances. Some would say, "She played with so much emotion, you could feel every note." Others would tell their children, "You know, she once played a song that made an entire hall go silent." But for her, it was never about what people remembered, it was about what they felt. Every student she taught carried a small piece of her story with them. And whenever they touched the keys and played their first clear melody, it was like her journey continued through them. One afternoon, long after her students had gone home, she stayed behind to clean up the room. The sun was setting, and its golden light fell across the piano keys. She paused, touching them softly, and smiled. The world outside was full of noise, cars, voices, laughter. But in that small room, there was peace. And that peace was enough. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened, not to the sounds around her, but to the silence that had followed her all these years, the silence that began the day her music had silenced the whole room. That silence was no longer empty. It was full of stories, memories, and meaning. It was her reminder that sometimes, the quietest people leave the loudest echoes. And so, she kept playing, one song at a time, soft, patient, and full of heart, knowing that even if no one else was listening, the world would always remember the silence that her music once created.